Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic, and I'm back with another video. Now today I'm going to be showing you how to replace the spark plugs on a 3.6 liter Pentastar engine that you can find in the Dodge Chargers, the Dodge Challengers, and the Chrysler 300s. Check it out. Usually there's a plastic cover that covers up the top half of the engine right here. It's got a little cutout right here for the oil filter. You can actually see a line right here where it used to be. This one doesn't have it on it. Whoever worked on it last more than likely didn't put it back on, but usually you would see a plastic cover sitting right on top of the engine that you would just pick up and sit it to the side. Now it does not matter if you're doing the plugs, the oil filter housing, or the oil pressure sending unit. Whatever you do, you're going to have to take off all the following items. The air inlet that goes over here to the throttle body is going to need to come off, and also the upper intake. With the upper intake off, you've got access to the spark plugs, but in order to get to the cooler assembly, you're going to have to take the lower intake assembly off. So what we'll do is we'll start with getting the air inlet off first. Now one thing that I prefer to do is to leave the upper air filter lid attached to the air inlet going to the throttle body. You could separate it right here where the flexible joint is, but what I do is I go around the perimeter, I take the 3 8mm off, and I take the hose off right here that leads back to one of the valve covers, and I leave this attached to the air inlet. That way I can pick it up and I've got a little more room. Now the hose, get whatever you can to pry it off. You may have to rotate it slightly. You may just take a gentle motion like this. We've got that off. Now we can pick up on the front of the housing, and now we've got it released. Now we'll move on further down. Now if you follow the air inlet around to the throttle body, you'll see that there's one hose clamp right here, a larger one. You can get you a flat tip screwdriver or an 8mm, back it off. And what we're going to do now is we're going to pick up on the front half, because there's a rubber bushing that sits on a mount right here. We don't want to break it off, so we just kind of wiggle it till we finally get it loose, and we can work on getting it off the throttle body. Now we got one connector back here we've got to disconnect. That's for the air intake temp sensor. Just squeeze in on the lock and pick it up. Now here's that rubber bushing I was telling you about, and it goes directly on a ball mount right here on the right side valve cover. When you go back with it, apply a little bit of grease so when it lines up, it easily sinks back in place. Now we can pick it up and set this off to the side. Now the upper intake has a series of brackets around the outside, or braces. Kind of keeps it rigid, stops it from flexing, stops it from cracking. We've got 2 brackets over here on the left side of the engine that are attached with 2 10mm nuts that will be taken off. And also back here behind where the throttle body is, on the back side of this intake, we've got another bracket. Now that's got a studded bolt and also 2 nuts that will be taken off. So we'll go ahead and start with the 2 10mm over here, and then we'll move over to those shortly afterwards. Now what I've found that works great for taking those 2 10mm nuts off that are both here and there is a 10mm ratchet wrench. And get right down on there, break it loose, and get them loose enough to where I can get them off the rest of the way by hand. And that's the first one right there. Now I can move over to the second one. Then I'll know that the brackets on this side are unbolted from the intake. And what's going to help so that you can get to the 2 nuts and that studded bolt that holds the bracket on the back of the intake is to go ahead and start taking everything electrical and all the vacuum and rubber lines off the throttle body and the upper intake. Once you get those out of the way, you've got a little more room to see everything and to get to everything. So that's what we'll move on to next. We'll go ahead and get some of these electrical connectors disconnected and pull the rubber hoses off. Now in order to release the connector for the electronic throttle body, we've got to release this connector right here, and it's got a 2-stage lock on it. The gray portion right here is going to slide back. Once we slide it back, like I said, if you need to use something like this flat tip screwdriver to help you, so be it. Once you release that, then you can actually squeeze down on it and slide the connector off. Now we just take the catch right here that positions the harness right here, pull that off as well. Located directly behind the electronic throttle body is a sensor. and that sensor is the map sensor. It's got a gray colored connector on this particular vehicle with a red secondary lock. Now in order to release that, you're going to have to slide the red portion back. Use whatever tool you need. Usually sometimes you can get it with your fingers. Sometimes if it's been on for a while, you're going to have to use something like a flat tip screwdriver. Once that secondary lock is slid back, you can squeeze in on the gray connector and release it. Now with that map sensor disconnected, we need to pull up on the wiring. We don't need the wiring attached to the upper intake because we'll be pulling it off. So plastic / metal fastener right here that grabs on one of the ribs right here and kind of guides the wiring. That's what we just released and pulled off. Now we'll move on to the vacuum hose right here. I'm using nothing more than a pair of needle nose. Kind of break it loose and work it up and off. Now the intake has 2 more rubber hoses we need to get off. We've got one right here that leads over to the brake booster, and we've got one right here that goes from the intake down to the PCV valve. So these 2 right here need to be taken off. We'll kind of do the same thing we did with this hose right here. Grab a pair of needle nose, see if we can break it loose by rotating it, and then pry it off. One off. Now we'll move over to the back one for that PCV valve. There you have it. The PCV valve hose is now off the intake. Now if you look right here, you see me pointing to 2 10mm nuts. That's 2 of them that we need to take off for the bracket. 13mm studded bolt will be further down in there, but we'll work on getting to those. Now if you need a little room, you can actually take this wiring harness off the bracket. It's fastened or routed there with one of those plastic Christmas tree type fasteners. I'll take it. That way you got a little more room, get to everything. Now we'll move down into showing you where that 13mm studded bolt is. Now this is where I just took off those 2 10mm nuts, and this is the bracket that we're working on. If you look right here, you'll see that there's a wiring harness, and that wiring harness has a plastic guide right here, and that guide slides over that 13mm studded bolt. And the reason why it's studded is so that that guide has somewhere to attach and keeps the wiring harness from rubbing up against things it doesn't need to come in contact with. So what I've got to do is I've got to slide that guide off that 13mm studded bolt, and then I can get access to it, start backing it all the way off, take the bolt off, and then the bracket can be pulled out of the way to where the studs that come through the intake right here, that those 10mm nuts for holding on, will no longer be going through the bracket, and then I can start working on unbolting the intake and taking it off. So like I said, we'll go ahead and start using whatever we need to, pry bar, long needle nose, whatever it takes to pry that wiring harness off that studded 13. Actually some long needle nose, you get down in there between the bolt and the plastic, start prying on it so it starts releasing. There you have it. And now I can get down to this stud right here. Like I said, it's a 13mm. Now the upper intake's bolted to the lower intake with a total of 7 8mm bolts. Now what I recommend using is a 1/4 inch 8mm, because you don't have a lot of room in some of these places, and your 3/8 8mm is usually going to be too wide. I've got it attached to a cordless impact. I'm just going to go down and do each one until we have them all backed off. So now at this point we have nothing electrical, no rubber hoses, no bolts, no brackets holding it in place. We do have 2 studs over here with the 2 10mm went through the brackets. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up and come out the right side. There you have it. If you look right here, you'll see the 2 studs that I was telling you about and the 2 brackets that they go through. And when we go back with them, we're going to do this. We're going to line up those studs through the brackets. We're going to lower it down in place. Make sure we slide them in there, because we only took 1 bracket off and we left those 2 in place. Now the upper intake's off, what I want you to do is grab you 2 rags, shove them down into the holes here. And what we're trying to do is prevent anything from getting dropped down into the ports, leading down to the valves. If anything gets down in there, you could cause damage to the engine. So go ahead and put something over there to prevent anything from falling down. Now to get access to the spark plugs, we've got to unbolt the coils and take them off. You also got an electrical connector on that we've got to squeeze. The bolt's going to be 10 millimeter, and the connector's got a single stage lock, so all you got to do is press down and slide it off. So now we work on the 10 millimeter bolts. Now the 10 millimeter bolts are designed to stay on the coil pack, but you could back it all the way out accidentally. All you need to do is back it out enough to get it off the cylinder head. Now take a close look at your coil pack while you've got it off. We want to look at the rubber boot here and make sure we don't see any white pinholes. Usually if it's going to be any arcing coming through the boot, it'll leave a perfect white circle, real small. Just make sure you don't see anything there, because that pinhole will cause a misfire code. So if you're replacing your plugs because you think it's misfiring because of that, you could have a problem with one of the boots. So like I said, take a second and look it over real thoroughly. Now we'll move on to actually getting the plug out. Now we're going to be using a 5/8 spark plug socket. Just get your extension long enough to get out of the spark plug tube and back it off by hand. And then what we'll do is we'll repeat this all the way down the line with the remaining 5. We'll get the coil packs off and back the plugs off and pull them out as well. And when you get your spark plugs out, one thing I want you to do is I want you to keep it. Don't throw it away too fast, because you want to compare what the original one looks like and your replacement one, because heaven forbid the parts person gave you the wrong ones. You don't want to just be slapping them in there and find out there's a difference in length. So definitely hold on to your old plugs until you're completely done with the job. Now when it comes time to gapping the spark plug, make sure you set it at the proper specifications. Now in this vehicle we're going 1.1 millimeter or 43 thousandths of an inch. But if you've got a different year engine or different model, such as maybe a Ram truck, double check to make sure that that specification is the same for yours. Also, when you go back, you may want to apply a slight coating of anti-seize. Down here in the south we don't really need it, but up north it's something that you definitely want to put a slight coating on before you thread it back into the spark plug tube hole. Now what I recommend doing is starting these spark plugs by hand. Run them down to where they're snug. At that point, we're going to grab a torque wrench. We're going to torque it to spec. Now the specs on this particular vehicle are 13 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and get that to the proper torque. At that point, we go ahead and start putting the coil pack back on. Now there's no specific torque for the actual coil packs, just snug them down gently. And then what we'll do is we'll move on putting the intake back on, and I'll mention about the sequence you'll be using for that and also the torque spec. Now it's just a matter of reinstalling the coil pack. Make sure it's fully seated. Plug in the connector, and I'll snug up on the bolt. Doesn't have to be excessively tight, just enough to hold it in place. Now the only difference with doing the spark plugs on the left side cylinder head is that you've got to remove this foam pad. Once you take it out of the way, you've got access to the coil packs and the connectors just like you did on the right side. Just make sure that when you're done, you do go back with that foam pad. Now before we go installing that upper intake, we've got to do some prep work first. We need to replace the upper intake gaskets. Now they sit right here into the little grooves that are cut out in the lower intake. You can grab either a pick or a flat tip screwdriver, whatever you can get down in there with. And you pick up the old seal, and what you do is you just grab your new one, place it in the groove, and press down gently till it's fully seated. And then all you got to do is repeat it on the other 5 as well. Now one thing I do recommend once you're done with that, look down in your ports, make sure once again you don't see anything, and it doesn't hurt to blow some compressed air in there, so if there is anything it can blow back out. So double check these before you worry about putting the upper intake on. So now we're ready for the upper intake. Remember, we're going to guide it over here to the side, make sure they go into each one of the brackets, and we're going to sit the intake down, make sure all your vacuum hoses, anything electrical is out of the way. Now that it's firmly seated, we're going to start snugging down the bolts, but there's a particular order we need to follow. And number one is going to be the bolt furthest to the rear. So let's go ahead and start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So follow that procedure and you shouldn't have any problems. Once again, do that hand tight and then follow back with a torque wrench. And the specifications on the torque is going to be 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds on all the bolts around the intake, the upper to the lower. So now that you've got that intake torque back down, the installation of everything as far as the electrical connectors, vacuum lines, the bracketry on the rear, the nuts in different places, is pretty much just going to be the opposite of how we took it off. So just follow the steps that you used when we removed everything and you shouldn't have any problems. So now you know all the steps involved when it comes time to replacing your spark plugs on that 3.6 liter Dodge Charger, Dodge Challenger, and Chrysler 300. So, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget you can like me on Facebook, check me out on Instagram and Twitter as well. If you got any comments or suggestions about today's video, or anything Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, or Ram related, you can always email me at david@motorcitymechanic.com and I'll try to get back to you in a timely manner. Once again, everybody, thanks for all the comments and for the feedback, and keep watching.